All right, we're diving deep into sexting today. It's a bit of a spicy topic, right?
It is, yeah. And it's interesting because, well, it's not always as straightforward as people think.
Definitely not. You sent over some fascinating research on it. And, you know, I was especially intrigued by the idea that sexting plays out very differently in casual versus committed relationships.
Oh, absolutely. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Right. You can't just be sending the same messages to everyone,
Yeah.
right? But really, how does it change? Like, what makes sexting in a committed relationship different from, say, a casual hookup?
Where in casual relationships, it's often about, well, that initial spark. It's like a quick burst of energy, very much focused on the physical side of things. Think quick flirty messages, maybe setting the scene for a hookup.
Mhm.
It can be pretty explicit, and the emotional investment is, generally speaking, lower.
Okay, so instant gratification. Got it. But then what happens when we move into a committed relationship? Does it change? How does it evolve?
Oh, it definitely evolves. When you're already emotionally connected, sexting becomes less about those, instant fireworks and more about nurturing the intimacy that's already there. It's almost like it's almost like sending a love letter, but with a bit more heat, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I get it. It becomes this way to stay connected, especially when you're apart, right?
Right. And you can build anticipation for when you are together,
Right.
and it can be a really safe space to explore fantasies.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's going from like, let's get this on to let's keep this fire burning.
Exactly.
But does that actually shift the feeling of sexting, like emotionally speaking? Does it feel different?
It can, yeah. In those casual situations, sexting can feel, exciting on the surface, sure. But sometimes I think it can lack an emotional depth. And for some people, I think that can actually lead to them feeling empty or even a bit insecure, especially if one person maybe is hoping for something more.
Oh, totally. Almost like a sugar rush, that quick
Hmm.
high followed by a crash.
Yeah, like that.
And I bet those mismatched expectations, they can lead to some drama.
Oh, for sure. But contrast that with committed relationships
Yeah.
because you already have that intimacy, that trust. Sexing feels much more connected to genuine feelings. You're letting your partner see this vulnerable side of yourself, and that can actually strengthen the bond between you.
So it's less about putting on a show and more about genuine connection. Makes sense. But let's be real. Even in the most committed relationships, things can get messy if you're not careful. Like, how do you even begin to set boundaries around something like sexting? Where do you even start?
Boundaries are so important no matter what. But you're right, it can be tricky. And I think the biggest difference between those casual and committed scenarios is the level of communication. You see, in a casual situation, those boundaries are often unspoken or really ambiguous.
Yeah.
People just, well, they don't want to rock the boat by having, the talk. They just kind of avoid it.
And hope for the best, right?
Right. They hope it'll all work out, but that almost never happens. It's like
Mm.
trying to assemble furniture without reading the instructions. It usually ends up a mess.
Totally. And that's when things go wrong, right? Misinterpretation, someone feels pressured. It's just, yeah, it's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in a committed relationship, you've ideally already built, you've already built that foundation of open communication.
Mm.
So talking about boundaries, what you're comfortable with, what's off limits, it feels more like just another way to show you care about each other's well-being, not a hurdle you have to get over.
Okay, that makes sense. Communication is key.
It is, definitely.
But even with the best of intentions, there are still risks, right? I mean, it can still go wrong.
Oh, absolutely. The risks just look different depending on the relationship.
Yeah.
In those casual hookups, it's often miscommunication that's the biggest problem.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
You might be going for playful banter, but the other person, might read it as something else. It's a declaration of love or something.
Yikes. I can see how that could be, well, how that could lead to some awkward
Oh,
conversations.
definitely. And then there's the privacy factor.
Hmm.
We're living in a digital age, so things can spread really fast.
Hmm.
And in those casual situations, especially where trust is still developing, it can feel risky to put yourself out there like
But you're
that.
not just protecting your heart, you're also protecting your digital image, too. But wait, you said there are risks even in committed relationships. I thought that was supposed to be, like, the safe zone.
It is generally safer because of that trust factor, yeah.
Yeah.
But there's this subtle danger that we need to talk about.
Okay, I'm listening.
Sometimes I think couples might lean on sexting as a quick fix for, deeper intimacy issues that they've been avoiding.
Oh, interesting. So instead of actually dealing with the problem, they're just using sexting as a distraction.
It can be like that, yeah. Imagine a couple going through a rough patch, right?
Yeah.
they're arguing a lot or they're not feeling as connected. And well, instead of having those tough conversations about what's really going on, they turn to sexting as this quick hit of, I don't know, validation, connection.
So it's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. It might look okay from the outside, but it's not actually fixing the problem.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to remember that, well, sexting can be incredibly powerful for intimacy, sure, but it shouldn't be a substitute for real life connection and dealing with those deeper issues that might be brewing under the surface.
All right, listener, take notes. Communication is key. I think we've laid a great foundation here, exploring how the same act can mean totally different things depending on the relationship. But before we jump into the nitty-gritty of all this, let's take a minute to digest what we've learned so far. I don't know, what stands out to you? Any thoughts?
I think what's most striking is just how important context is. The same sex, the same message even, can be playful,
Yeah.
flirty in one scenario and a total red flag in another.
Right. It all comes down to understanding those subtle nuances.
Absolutely.
And you know what? I'm already feeling more equipped to navigate this whole sexting thing with, I don't know, a bit more awareness and intention.
Great.
But we're just getting started. There's so much more to unpack when it comes to how sexting, how it intertwines with intimacy, with trust, with communication.
There is. We haven't even touched on the potential impact of sexting on those areas yet.
Right. And I'm dying to know, can sexting actually build trust? Or is it just a recipe for a disaster? We'll be exploring all of that and more in our next segment, so don't go anywhere.
So how does sexting actually impact intimacy? We were talking about how it's different in casual versus committed relationships.
Yeah, let's dig into that. I'm really curious about how those digital exchanges can actually influence real-world connections. You know what I mean?
It's interesting because in those casual relationships, sexting can create this feeling of intimacy, but it often, I think, has a bit of an expiration date.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like instant intimacy almost.
You could say that, yeah. It's a way to explore desires and fantasies without needing, a super deep emotional bond, which makes sense, I think, when you think about it, because casual relationships, they're often more focused on, well, on the physical aspect.
Right. It's all about that initial spark. But then how does sexting affect intimacy when you're in a relationship that's built on, I don't know, more than just physical attraction?
That's where things get really, really interesting, I think. Because when you already have that strong emotional connection, sexting can actually become this really powerful way to express desire, affection, even vulnerability. It's
Right.
like adding fuel to a fire.
Oh, I like that. It's not just about keeping the spark alive, it's about deepening the connection you already have.
Exactly. And it can be incredibly empowering for both partners to feel seen and desired, in that way.
Totally. But I'm also wondering about the flip side. Can sexting ever have a negative impact on intimacy?
It definitely can. I mean, while it can enhance intimacy, it's important to be mindful of, how it's actually being used. One potential pitfall, I think, is when sexting becomes the primary mode of communication about sex and intimacy.
So instead of actually talking to each other, they're just sending sexy messages back and forth.
Exactly. And that can actually create a disconnect, I think, between how couples are interacting, online versus how they're relating to each other in person.
Oh, that makes sense. It's like they're building a relationship on this foundation of, I don't know, emojis instead of actual emotional connection.
It's all about balance, really. Sexting can be a really fun way to spice things up, but it shouldn't overshadow, I think, the importance of those face-to-face conversations, physical touch, and those shared experiences that really build true intimacy.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that technology can be a great tool, but it shouldn't be replacing the real deal.
Especially in those committed relationships where, the goal is to create something lasting and meaningful.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about intimacy, but now I'm curious about how sexting plays into trust. Can it actually strengthen trust, or is it more likely to, I don't know, erode it, especially in those early stages of a relationship, when things are still a bit fragile?
That's a really great question. In those casual relationships where trust is still fragile, Sexting can be, I think, a bit of a gamble. If both people are respectful and honest and clear about their intentions, it can actually help build a sense of trust.
But if one person feels like pressured or uncomfortable, I mean, that can just shatter so quickly.
Oh, absolutely. And the risk of miscommunication is so much higher when you don't have that solid foundation of trust to begin with.
It's like you're walking a tightrope. One wrong step and everything just comes crashing down.
Exactly. But in a committed relationship where, hopefully you've already established that sense of security and openness, how does sexting affect trust there?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Well, when that trust is already there, I think sexting can be this really amazing way to deepen that bond even further.
Yeah.
Because you're sharing something so personal and intimate,
Mm.
right? It can make the relationship feel even more special and unique.
Oh yeah, totally. It's like you're entrusting your partner with this piece of your heart in a way. But then what happens if that trust is broken? Like what if a message or an image is shared without consent?
That can be incredibly damaging to any relationship, but especially to a committed one, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's it's a violation of privacy, it's a betrayal of trust, and it can be so difficult to overcome.
I can only imagine it would feel like the ultimate betrayal.
It really can. And
Yeah.
and that's why it's just so crucial to talk about, you know, boundaries, expectations, and the potential consequences
Yeah.
of sharing sensitive content. Even in a committed relationship, it's important to remember that trust is it's something that you have to continuously nurture.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered intimacy, we've covered trust, but there's one more piece of the puzzle that I want to explore, and that's communication. How can sexting impact, communication and connection in both casual and committed relationships?
This is where things get really interesting, I think. Because in those casual relationships, sexting can sometimes be almost a way to avoid deeper conversation.
Oh, interesting. So instead of like actually getting to know each other on a more meaningful level, they're just sticking to, I don't know, flirty banter and sexual innuendos.
Exactly, yeah. It can be so tempting to stay in that superficial zone, especially if you're not looking for anything serious.
But real connection, I mean, it requires more than just, physical attraction.
Absolutely. While sexting can be, fun and playful, it it shouldn't be the only way that you're communicating.
So it's like having dessert but skipping the main course.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You might satisfy your sweet tooth in the moment,
Yeah,
but you're going to eventually crave something more substantial.
that's a great analogy. But what about in a committed relationship? Can sexting actually enhance communication?
It definitely can. I think when it's used thoughtfully and intentionally, sexting can actually be a really great way to express desires and fantasies that might be harder to talk about face to face.
Oh yeah, like it's almost like having a secret language that only the two of you understand.
Exactly. And it can really help couples break down barriers and communicate on a much deeper level.
That's so cool. But I'm also wondering about the potential downsides. Can sexting ever hinder communication in a committed relationship?
Oh, absolutely. If couples are relying too heavily on sexting and they start neglecting, those other forms of communication, it can actually create this disconnect. It's almost like they're speaking different languages, one digital and one in person.
And that can lead to all sorts of, misunderstandings and unmet needs.
Exactly. Again, it's all about finding that balance where sexting, enhances communication rather than replacing it.
Right, right. Okay, so we've talked about intimacy, we've talked about trust, and we've talked about communication, all these complex factors that can be influenced by sexting. And we've seen how differently it can play out in casual versus committed relationships.
We've barely scratched the surface, but I think we've given our listener a lot to think about.
I agree. And speaking of things to think about, there's one more crucial aspect of sexting that we need to explore, and that's the ethical considerations. Okay, so let's talk ethics. Sexting, it's one of those things that people don't always, I think, stop to think about the ethical side of it, but it is super important, especially in today's world.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely one of those areas where things can get murky really fast because the
Yeah.
rules they're still kind of being written.
Yeah, totally. So where do we even begin? Like what are the ground rules, the ethical guidelines for for sexting?
Well, the most important principle, hands down, is consent. Making sure that everyone involved is enthusiastically and freely consenting to sharing those messages or images. It sounds pretty straightforward, but in practice, it can actually get pretty complicated.
Especially in those casual relationships where, you might not know each other that well,
Right.
or the boundaries aren't super clear.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have those open and honest conversations, talking about what you're both comfortable with, what's off limits, and making sure that you're really truly on the same page.
So it's not just about getting a yes at the beginning. It's about, checking in throughout the exchange and
Mhm.
making sure that everyone's still feeling good about it.
Exactly. Consent is an ongoing process. It's not a one-time thing.
Yeah.
And it can be revoked at any point, no questions asked.
Okay, consent check. What else? What else should we be mindful of?
Well, privacy is huge. Those messages, those images, they're meant for the people involved and no one else.
So no, like sharing screenshots with your friends for a good laugh, or posting them online without permission.
Definitely not. I mean,
Yeah.
sharing someone's intimate content without their consent it's a major violation of trust and privacy.
Yeah.
Not to mention there are legal ramifications that can come into play.
Right, right. It's a good point. We often, I think, forget that once something's out there digitally, it can be really, really hard to like fully erase it. But even if everyone's consenting, even if everyone's being respectful of privacy, there's still the potential for, hurt feelings.
No, absolutely. We all interpret things differently, and
Mhm.
and what might seem playful or flirty to one person could be misconstrued by another.
So even with the best intentions, things can still go wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just get consent. We also need to be aware of the potential impact of our actions and really take responsibility for how our words and our images might affect the other person.
Okay, so ethical sexting it's not just about following the rules. It's about being respectful, being communicative, and really just thinking about the other person's feelings.
It is. It's about treating each other with care, both online and offline.
Well said. This has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like I've learned so much about the nuances of sexting and how to approach it in a way that feels, I don't know, safe, respectful, and even empowering.
Me too. It's been great to really delve into these different aspects and really unpack all the complexity.
Absolutely. Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listener with one final thought to ponder. In a world where digital communication is constantly evolving, how can we embrace the potential of sexting to enhance our relationships, our connections, without sacrificing our privacy, our safety, or our emotional well-being?
That's a fantastic question to leave our listener with. It really encourages us to think critically about how we're using technology to connect with others and to make conscious choices that prioritize respect, open communication, and mindful engagement.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of sexting. We hope this conversation has provided some valuable insights and maybe even spark some deeper reflection. Until next time, remember knowledge is power, especially when it comes to navigating the ever evolving landscape of relationships in the digital age.